this version of Saturday Night Stories is going to be a little bit shorter. There's no beer tonight. Tonight I'm sticking with water. I already brushed my teeth, and then I realized, oh, beer and toothpaste don't really go together. So we're just doing water. That's fine. Fine with me. I can just do that. Tonight I'm also reading from my iPad. I was thinking of reading a short story from one of my more enjoyed authors, Neil Gaiman. He wrote this story in 1994. It's 5,000 words, and I'm sure you understand what this story is about. I'm going to sit a little closer today, because I would like to speak a little quieter this time. Hopefully you don't mind. And if you do, too bad. Okay, so this story is called Snow, Glass, Apples. Copyright 1994, Neil Gaiman. I do not know what manner of thing she is. None of us do. She killed her mother in the birthing, but that's never enough to account for it. They call me wise, but I am far from wise, for all that I foresaw fragments of it, frozen moments caught in pools of water, or in the cold glass of my mirror. If I were wise, I would have not tried to change what I saw. If I were wise, I would have killed myself before I ever encountered her, before I ever caught him. Wise and a witch, or so they said, and I'd seen his face in my dreams, and in the reflections. For all my life, 16 years of dreaming of him before he reined his horse by the bridge that morning and asked my name. He helped me onto his high horse, and we rode together to my little cottage, my face buried in the gold of his hair. He asked for the best of what I had. A king's right, it was. His beard was red bronze in the morning light, and I knew him not as a king, for I knew nothing of kings then, but as my love. He took all he wanted from me, the right of kings, but he returned to me on the following day, all on the night after that, and on the night after that, his beard so red, his hair so gold, his eyes the blue of a summer day, his skin tanned the gentle brown of ripe wheat. His daughter was only a child, no more than 5 years of age, when I came to the palace. A portrait of her dead mother hung in the princess's tower room. A tall woman, hair the color of dark wood, eyes nut brown. She was of a different blood to her pale daughter. The girl would not eat with us. I do not know where in the palace she ate. I had my own chambers. My husband was the king. He had his own rooms also. When he wanted me, he would send for me, and I would go to him and pleasure him and take my pleasure with him. One night, several months after I was brought to the palace, she came to my rooms. She was 6. I was embroidering by the lamplight, squinting my eyes against the lamp smoke in fitful illumination. When I looked up, she was there. Princess? She said nothing. Her eyes were as black as coal, black as her hair. Her lips were redder than blood. She looked at me and smiled. Her teeth seemed sharp, even then, in the lamplight. What are you doing away from your room? I'm hungry, she said, like any child. It was winter, when fresh food is a dream of warmth and sunlight, but I had strings of whole apples, cored and dried, hanging from the beams of my chamber, and I pulled an apple down for her. Here, autumn is the time of drying, of preserving, a time of picking apples, of rendering the goose fat. Winter is the time of hunger, of snow and of death, and it is the time of the midwinter feast, when we rub the goose fat into the skin of a whole pig stuffed with that autumn's apples. Then we roast it or spit it and and we prepared a feast upon the crackling. She took the dried apple from me and began to chew it with her sharp yellow teeth. "Is it good?" She nodded. I had always been scared of the little princess, but at that moment I warmed to her, and with my fingers gently I stroked her cheek. She looked at me and smiled. She smiled, but rarely. Then she sank her teeth into the base of my thumb, the mound of Venus, and she drew blood. I began to shriek from pain and from surprise, but she looked at me and I fell silent. The little princess fastened her mouth to my hand and licked and sucked and drank. When she was finished, she left my chamber. Beneath my gaze, the cut that she had made began to close, to scab and heal. The next day it was an old scar. I might have caught my hand with a pocket knife in my childhood. I had been frozen by her, owned and dominated. That scared me more than the blood she had fed on. After that night I locked my chamber door at dusk, barring it with an oaken pole, and I had the smith forge iron bars which he placed across my windows. My husband, my love, my king, sent for me less and less, and when I came to him he was dizzy, listless, confused. He could no longer make love as a man makes love, and he would not permit me to pleasure him with my mouth. The one time I tried, he stared violently and began to weep. I pulled my mouth away and held him tightly until the sobbing had stopped, and he slept like a child. I ran my fingers across his skin as he slept. It was covered in a multitude of ancient scars, but I could recall no scars from the day of our courtship, save for one on his side where a boar had gored him when he was a youth. Soon he was a shadow of the man I had met and loved by the bridge. His bones showed, blue and white, beneath his skin. I was with him at the last. His hands were cold as stone, his eyes were milky blue. His hair and beard faded and lusterless and limp. He died unshriven, his skin nipped and pocked from head to toe with tiny old scars. He weighed near to nothing. The ground was frozen hard, and we could dig no grave for him, so we made him a cairn of rocks and stones above his body as a memorial only, for there was little enough of him to protect from the hunger of the beasts and the birds. So I was queen. And I was foolish and young. 18 summers had come and gone since I first saw daylight, and I did not do what I would do now. If it were today, I would have cut her heart out, true, but then I would have had her head and arms and legs cut off. I would have had them disembowel her, and then I would watch in the town square as the hangman heated the fire to white heat with bellows, watching unblinkingly as he consigned each part of her to the fire. I would have archers around the square who would shoot any bird or animal who came close to the flames, any raven or dog or hawk or rat. And I would not close my eyes until the princess was ash and a gentle wind could scatter her like snow. I did not do this thing, and we pay for our mistakes. They say I was fooled, that it was not her heart, that it was the heart of an animal, a stag perhaps, or a boar. They say that, and they are wrong. And some say, but it is her lie, not mine, that I was given the heart, and that I ate it. Lies and half-truths fall like snow, covering the things that I remember, the things I saw. A landscape, unrecognizable after a snowfall, that is what she has made of my life. There were scars on my love, her father's thighs, and on his ballock pouch, and on his male member when he died. Yikes. I did not go with them. They took her in the day while she slept and was at her weakest. They took her to the heart of the forest, and they opened her blouse, and they cut out her heart, and they left her dead in a gully for the forest to swallow. The forest is a dark place, the border to many kingdoms no one would be foolish enough to claim jurisdiction over. Outlaws live in the forest, robbers live in the forest, and so do wolves. You can ride through the forest for a dozen days and never see a soul, but there are eyes upon you the entire time. They brought me her heart, I know it was hers. No sow's heart or doe's would have continued to beat and pulse after it had been cut out, as that one did. I took it to my chamber. I did not eat it. I hung it from the beams above my bed, placed it on a length of twine that I strung around with rowan berries, orange red as a robin's breast, and with bulbs of garlic. Outside, the snow fell, covering the footprints of my huntsman, covering her tiny body in the forest where it lay. I had the smith remove the iron bars from my windows, and I would spend some time in my room each afternoon through the short winter days, gazing out over the darkness of the forest until it was nighttime. There were, as I have already stated, people in the forest. They would come out, some of them, for the spring's fair. A greedy, feral, dangerous people. Some were stunted, dwarves and midgets and hunchbacks. Others had the huge teeth and vacant gazes of idiots. Some had fingers like flippers or crab claws. They would creep out of the forest each year for the spring fair when the snows had melted. As a young lass, I had worked at the fair, and they had scared me then. The forest folk. I told fortunes for the fair-goers, scrying in a pool of still water, and still later, when I was older, in a disc of polished glass, its back all silvered, a gift from a merchant whose straying horse I had seen in a pool of ink. The stall holders at the fair were afraid of the forest folk. They would nail their wares to the bare boards of their stalls. Slabs of gingerbread or leather belts were nailed with great iron nails to the wood. If their wares were not nailed, they said, the forest folk would take them, run away, chewing on the stolen gingerbread, flailing about them with the belts. The forest folk had money, though. A coin here, another there, sometimes stained green by the time or the earth. The face on the coin unknown to even the oldest of us. Also, they had things to trade, and thus the fair continued, serving the outcast, the dwarves, serving the robbers, if they were circumspect, who preyed on the rare travelers from lands beyond the forest, or on the gypsies, or on the deer. This was robbery in the eyes of the law. The deer were the queens. The years passed slowly, and my people claimed that I ruled them with wisdom. The heart still hung above my bed, pulsing gently in the night. If there were any who mourned the child, I saw no evidence. She was a thing of terror back then, and they believed themselves well rid of her. Spring fair followed spring fair. 5 of them, each sadder, poorer, shoddier than the one before. Fewer of the forest folk came out of the forest to buy. Those who did seemed subdued and listless. The stall holders stopped nailing their wares to the boards of their stalls, and by the 5th year but a handful of folk came from the forest, a fearful huddle of little men, and no one else. The lord of the fair and his page came to me when the fair was done. I had known him slightly before I was queen. I do not come to you as my queen, he said. I said nothing. I listened. I come to you because you are wise. He continued, when you were a child, you found a strayed foal by staring into a pool of ink. When you were a maiden, you found a lost infant who had wandered far from her mother by staring into that mirror of yours. You know secrets, and you can seek out things hidden. My queen, he asked, what is taking the forest folk? Next year there will be no spring fair. The travelers from other kingdoms have grown scarce and few, and the forest folk are almost gone. Another year like the last, and we shall all starve. I commanded my maidservant to bring me my looking-glass. It was a simple thing, a silver-backed glass disc, which I kept wrapped in a doeskin in a chest in my chamber. They brought it to me. and I gazed into it. She was 12 and no longer a little child. Her skin was still pale, her eyes and hair coal black, her lips as red as blood. She wore the clothes she had worn when she left the castle the last time. The blouse, the skirt, although they were much let out and much mended. Over them she wore a leather cloak, and instead of boots she had leather bags tied with thongs over her tiny feet. She was standing in the forest beside a tree. As I watched, in the eye of my mind I saw her edge and step and flitter and pad from tree to tree like an animal, a bat or a wolf. She was following someone. He was a monk. He wore sackcloth and his feet were bare, scabbed and hard. His beard and tonsure were a length, overgrown, unshaved. She watched him from behind the trees. Eventually he paused for the night and began to make a fire, laying twigs down, breaking up a robin's nest as kindling. He had a tinder box in his robe, and he knocked the flint against the steel until the sparks caught under the tinder, and the fire flamed. There had been 2 eggs in the nest he had found, and he ate those raw. They could not have been much of a meal for so big a man. He sat there in the firelight, and she came out from her hiding place. She crouched down on the other side of the fire and stared at him. He grinned, as if it were a long time since he had seen another human, and beckoned her over to him. She stood up and walked around the fire and waited an arm's length away. He pulled in his robe until he found a coin, a tiny copper penny, and tossed it to her. She caught it and nodded and went to him. He pulled at the rope around his waist, and his robe swung open. His body was as hairy as a bear's. She pushed him back onto the moss. One hand crept spider-like through the tangle of hair until it closed on his manhood, and the other hand traced a circle on his left nipple. He closed his eyes and fumbled one huge hand under her skirt. She lowered her mouth to the nipple she had been teasing, her smooth skin white on the furry brown body of him. She sank her teeth deep into his breast. His eyes opened and they closed again, and she drank. She straddled him and she fed, and she did so a thin As she did so, a thin blackish liquid began to dribble from between her legs. Do you know what is keeping the people, the travelers from our town? What is happening to the forest people? Asked the head of the fair. I covered the mirror in doeskin and told him that I would personally take it upon myself to make the forest safe once more. I had to, although she terrified me. I was the queen. A foolish woman would have gone into the forest and tried to capture the creature, but I had been foolish once, and I had no wish to be foolish a second time. I spent time with old books, for I could read a little. I spent time with the gypsy women who passed through our country across the mountains to the south rather than across the forest to the north and west. I prepared myself and obtained those things I would need, and when the first snows began to fall, I was ready. Naked I was, and alone in the highest tower of the palace, a place open to the sky. The winds chilled my body, goose pimples crept across my arms and thighs and breasts. I carried a silver basin and a basket in which I placed a silver knife, a silver pin, some tongs, a gray robe, and 3 green apples. I put them down and stood there, unclothed on the tower, humble before the night and sky and wind. Had any man seen me standing there, I would have had his eyes, but there was no one to spy. Clouds scudded across the sky, hiding and uncovering the waning moon. I took the silver knife and slashed my left arm, once, twice, 3 times. The blood dripped into the basin, scarlet seeming black in the moonlight. I added the powder from the vial that hung around my neck. It was a brown dust made of dried herbs and the skin of a particular toad, and from certain other things. It thickened the blood while preventing it from clotting. Then I took the apples, one by one, and pricked their skins gently with my silver pin. Then I placed the apples in the silver bowl and let them sit there while the first tiny flakes of snow of the year slowly fell onto my skin and onto the apples and onto the blood. When dawn began to brighten the sky, I covered myself with the gray cloak and took the red apples from the silver bowl, one by one, lifting each into my basket with silver tongs, being careful not to touch them. There was nothing left of my blood or of the brown powder inside the silver bowl, save nothing but a black residue, like a verdigris, on the inside. I buried the bowl in the earth, then I cast a glamour spell on the apples, as once, years before by a bridge, I had cast a glamour on myself. They were there, beyond any doubt. They were the most wonderful apples in the world, and the crimson blush of their skins was the warm color of fresh blood. I pulled the hood of my cloak low over my face, and I took ribbons and pretty hair ornaments with me. Placed them above the apples in the reed basket, and I walked alone into the forest until I came to her dwelling, a high sandstone cliff, laced with deep caves going back away into the rock wall. There were trees and boulders around the cliff face, and I walked quietly and gently from tree to tree without disturbing a twig or fallen leaf. Eventually I found my place to hide, and I waited and I watched. After some hours, a clutch of dwarves crawled out of the cave front, ugly, misshapen, hairy little men, the old inhabitants of this country. You saw them seldom now. They vanished into the wood, and none spied me, though one of them stopped to piss against the rock I hid behind. I waited, and no more came out. I went to the cave entrance and hallooed into it in a cracked old voice. The scar on my mound of Venus throbbed and pulsed as she came toward me out of the darkness, naked and alone. She was 13 years of age, my stepdaughter, and nothing marred the perfect whiteness of her skin save for the livid scar on her left breast where her heart had been cut from long since. The inside of her thighs were stained with the wet black filth. She peered at me, hidden as I was in my cloak. She looked at me hungrily. "Ribbons, good wife," I croaked. "Pretty ribbons for your hair." She smiled and beckoned to me. A tug, the scar on my hand was pulling me towards her. I did what I had planned to do, but I did it more readily than I had planned. I dropped my basket and screeched like the bloodless old peddler woman I was pretending to be, and I ran. My gray cloak was the color of the forest, and I was fast. She didn't catch me. I made my way back to the palace. I did not see it. Let us imagine, though, the girl returning, frustrated and hungry, to her cave and finding my fallen basket on the ground. What did she do? I like to think she first played with the ribbons, twined them into her raven hair, looped them around her pale neck or her tiny waist. And then, curious, she moved the cloth to see what else was in the basket. And she saw the red apples. They smelled like fresh apples, of course, and they also smelled of blood, and she was hungry. I imagined her picking up an apple, pressing it against her cheek, feeling the cold smoothness against her skin. And she opened her mouth and bit deep into it. By the time I reached my chambers, the little heart that hung from the roof beam with apples and hams and the dried sausages had ceased to beat. It hung there quietly without motion or life, and I felt safe once more. That winter, the snows were high and deep and were late melting. We were all hungry come the spring. The spring fair had slightly improved that year. The forest folk were few, but they were there, and there were travelers from lands beyond the forest. I saw the little hairy men of the forest cave buying and bargaining for pieces of glass and lumps of crystal and of quartz rock. They paid for the glass with silver coins, the spoils of my stepdaughter's depredations, I had no doubt. When it got about what they were buying, townsfolk rushed back to their homes and came back with their lucky crystals and, in a few cases, with whole sheets of glass. I thought briefly about having them killed, but I did not. As long as the heart hung silent and immobile and cold from the beam of my chamber, I was safe, and so were the folk of the forest, and thus, eventually, the folk of the town. My 25th year came, and my stepdaughter had eaten the poisoned fruit 2 winters back when the prince came to my palace. He was tall, very tall, with cold green eyes and the swarthy skin of those that come from beyond the mountains. He rode with a small retinue, large enough to defend him, small enough that another monarch, myself for instance, would not view him as a potential threat. I was practical. I thought of the alliance of our lands, thought of the kingdom running from the forests all the way to the south, to the sea. I thought of my golden-haired, bearded love, dead these 8 years, and in the night I went to my prince's room. I am no innocent, although my late husband, who was once my king, was truly my first lover, no matter what they say. At first, the prince seemed excited. He bade me remove my shift and made me stand in front of the opened window, far from the fire, until my skin was chilled stone cold. He then asked me to lie upon my back, with my hands folded across my breasts, my eyes wide open but staring only at the beams above. He told me not to move and to breathe as little as possible. He implored me to say nothing. He spread my legs apart. It was then that he entered me. As he began to thrust inside me, I felt my hips raise, felt myself begin to match him, grind for grind, push for push. I moaned, but I could not help myself. His manhood slid out of me. I reached out and touched it, a tiny, slippery thing. "Please," he said softly, "you must neither move nor speak. Just lie there on the stone, so cold and fair." I tried, but he had lost whatever force it was that made him virile. And some short while later I left the prince's room, his curses and tears still resounding in my ears. He left early the next morning with all of his men, and they rode off into the forest. I imagine his loins now as he rode, a knot of frustration at the base of his manhood. I imagine his pale lips pressed so tightly together. Then I imagine his little trope riding through the forest, finally coming upon the glass and crystal cairn of my stepdaughter, so pale, so cold, naked beneath the glass, and little more than a girl, and dead. In my fancy, I could almost feel the sudden hardness of his manhood inside his breeches, and vision the lust that took him then, the prayers he muttered beneath his breath in thanks for his good fortune. I imagine him negotiating with the tiny, hairy little men, offering them golden spices for the lovely corpse under the crystal mound. Did they take his gold willingly? Or did they look up to see his men on their horses with their sharp swords and their spears and realize they had no alternative? I do not know. I was not there. I was not scrying. I can only imagine. Hands pulling off the lumps of glass and quartz from her cold body. Hands gently caressing her cold cheek, moving her cold arm, rejoicing to find the corpse still fresh and pliable. Did he take her there in front of them all? Or did he have her carried to a secluded nook before he mounted her? I cannot say. Did he shake the apple from her throat, or did his eyes slowly open as he pounded into her cold body? Did her mouth open, those red lips apart, those sharp yellow teeth close on his swarthy neck, as the blood, which is the life, trickled down her throat, washing down and away the lump of apple, my own, my poison? I imagine, but I do not know. This I do know. I was awoken in the night by her heart pulsing and beating once more. Salt blood dripped onto my face from above. I sat up, and my hand burned and pounded as if I had hit the base of my thumb with a rock. There was a hammering on the door. I felt afraid, but I am queen, and I would not show fear. I opened the door. First his men walked into my chambers and stood around me with their sharp swords and their long spears. Then he came in and he spat on my face. Finally, she walked into my chamber, as she had when I was first a queen and she was a child of 6. She had not changed, not really. She pulled down the twine on which her heart was hanging. She pulled off the dried rowan berries, one by one, pulled off the garlic bulb, now a dried thing, after all these years. Then she took up her own pumping heart, a small thing no larger than that of a nanny goat or a she-bear, as it brimmed and pumped its blood into her hand. Her fingernails must have been as sharp as glass. She opened her breast with them, running them over the purple scar. Her chest gaped, suddenly open and bloodless. She licked her heart once as blood ran over her hands, and she pushed the heart deep into her breast. I saw her do it. I saw her close the flesh of her breast once more. I saw the purple scar begin to fade. Her prince looked briefly concerned, but he put his arm around her nonetheless, and they stood side by side, and they waited. And she stayed cold in the bed. The bloom of death remained on her lips, and his lust was not diminished in any way. They told me they would marry, and their kingdoms would indeed be joined. They told me that I would be with them on their wedding day. It is starting to get hot in here. They have told the people bad things about me, a little truth to add savor to the dish, but mixed with many lies. I was bound and kept in a tiny stone cell beneath the palace, and I remained there through the autumn. Today they fetched me out of the cell. They stripped the rags from me and washed the filth from me, and then they shaved my head and my loins, and they rubbed my skin with goose grease. The snow was falling as they carried me, 2 men at each hand, 2 men at each leg, utterly exposed and spread eagle and cold through the midwinter crowds, and brought me to this kiln. My stepdaughter stood there with her prince. She watched me in my indignity, but she said nothing. As they thrust me inside, jeering and chaffing as they did so, I saw one snowflake land upon her white cheek and remain there without melting. They closed the kiln door behind me. It is getting hotter in here, and outside they're singing and cheering and banging on the sides of the kiln. She was not laughing, or jeering or talking. She did not sneer at me or turn away. She looked at me, though, and for a moment I saw myself reflected in her eyes. I will not scream. I will not give them that satisfaction. They'll have my body, but my soul and my story are my own, and they'll die with me. The goose grease begins to melt and glisten upon my skin. I shall make no sound at all. I shall think no more of this. I shall think instead of the snowflake on her cheek. I think of her hair, as black as coal, her lips as red as blood, her skin snow white. The end of this one. Okay, so the next short story that I'm going to read is called The Case of the 4 and 20 Blackbirds by Neil Gaiman. I actually haven't read this one before. I'm actually reading it from his website. If you're interested, you can just go to www.neilgaiman.com and find it on his cool stuff side. I sat in my office, nursing a glass of hooch and idly cleaning my automatic. Outside, the rain fell steadily, like it seems to do most of the time in our fair city, whatever the tourist board said. Hell, I didn't care. I'm not the tourist board. I'm a private dick, and one of the best, although you wouldn't have known it. The office was crumbling, the rent was unpaid, and the hooch was my last. Things are tough all over. To cap it all, the only client I'd had all week never showed up on the street corner where I'd waited for him. He said it was going to be a big job, but now I'd never know he kept a prior appointment in the morgue. So when the dame walked into my office, I was sure my luck had changed for the better. "What are you selling, lady?" She gave me a look that would have induced heavy breathing as in a pumpkin, and which shot my heartbeat up to 3 figures. She had long blonde hair and a figure that would have made Thomas Aquinas forget his vows. I forgot all mine in never taking cases from dames. "What would you say to some of the green stuff?" she asked in a husky voice, getting straight to the point. "Continue, sister." I didn't want her to know how bad I needed the dough, so I held my hand in front of my mouth. It doesn't help if a client sees you salivate. She opened her purse and flipped out a photograph. Glossy 8x10. "Do you recognize that man?" "In my business, you know who people are." "Yeah, he's dead." I know that too, sweetheart. It's old news. It was an accident. Her gaze went so icy you could have chipped it into ice cubes and cooled a cocktail with it. My brother's death was no accident. I raised an eyebrow. You needed a lot of arcane skills in my business. And said, your brother, eh? Funny, she didn't strike me as the type that had brothers. I'm Jill Dumpty. So your brother was Humpty Dumpty. And if he didn't fall off that wall, Mr. Horner, he was pushed. Interesting, if true, Dumpty had his finger in the most of the crooked pies in the town. I could think of 5 guys who would have preferred to see him dead than alive without trying too hard, anyway. You seen the cops about this? Nah, the King's men aren't interested in anything to do with his death. They say they did all they could do in trying to put him back together again after the fall. I leaned back in my chair. So, what's it to you? Why do you need me? I want you to find the killer, Mr. Horner. I want him brought to justice. I want him to fry like an egg. Oh, and one other little thing, she added lightly. Before he died, Mr. Humpty had a small manila envelope full of photographs that he was meant to be sending to me. Medical photos. I'm a trainee nurse and I need them to pass my finals. I inspected my nails and then looked up at her face, taking in a handful of waist and Easter egg bazonkas on the way up. She was a looker, although her cute nose was a little on the shiny side. I'll take the case. 75 a day and 200 bonus for results. She smiled. My stomach twisted around once and went into orbit. You get another 200 if you give me those photographs. I want to be a nurse real bad. Then she dropped 350s onto my desktop. I let a devil-may-care grin play across my rugged face. Say, sister, how about letting me take you out for dinner? I just came into some money. She gave an involuntary shiver of anticipation and muttered something about having a thing about midgets, so I knew I was onto a good thing. Then she gave me a lopsided smile that would have made Albert Einstein drop a decimal point. First, find my brother's killer, Mr. Horner, and my photographs. Then we can play. She closed the door behind her. Maybe it was still raining, but I didn't notice. I didn't care. There are parts of town the tourist board doesn't mention. Parts of town where the police travel in threes if they travel at all. In my line of work, you get to visit them more than is healthy. Healthy is never. He was waiting for me outside of Luigi's. I slid up behind him, my rubber-soled shoes soundless on the wet, shiny sidewalk. Hiya, cock. He jumped and spun around, and I found myself gazing up into the muzzle of a 45. Oh, Horner. He put the gun away. Don't call me cock. I'm Bernie Robin to you. Short stuff, and don't you forget it. Cock Robin is good enough for me, cock, who killed Humpty Dumpty. He was a strange-looking bird, but you can't be choosy in my profession. He was the best underworld lead I had. Let's see the color of your money. I showed him a 50. Hell, he muttered. It's green. Why can't they make puce or mauve money for a change? He took it, though. All I know is that the fat man had his finger in a lot of pies. So, one of those pies had 4 and 20 blackbirds in it. Huh? Do I have to spell it out for you? He crumpled to the sidewalk, an arrow protruding from his back. Cock Robin wasn't going to be doing any more chirping. Sergeant O'Grady looked down at the body. Then he looked down at me. Faith and begorra to you, to be sure, he said, if it isn't little Jack Horner himself. I didn't kill Cock Robin, Sarge, and I suppose that the call we got down at the station telling us you were going to be rubbing the late Mr. Robin out here tonight, it was just a hoax. If I'm the killer, where are my arrows? I thumbed open a pack of gum and started to chew. It's a frame. He puffed on his mirrored shome and then put it away and idly played a couple of phrases of William Tell overture on his oboe. Maybe not, but you're still a suspect. don't leave town. And Horner, yeah, Dumpty's death was an accident. That's what the coroner said. That's what I say. So drop the case. I thought about it. Then I thought of the money and the girl. No dice, Sarge. He shrugged. It's your funeral. He said it like it probably would be. I had a funny feeling he might be right. You're out of your depth, Horner. You're playing with the big boys, and it ain't healthy. From what I could remember of my school days, he was correct. Whenever I played with the big boys, I always wound up having the stuffing beaten out of me. But how could O'Grady have known that? Then I remembered something else. O'Grady was the one who used to beat me up the most. It was time for what we in the profession call lake work. I made a few discreet enquiries around town, but found nothing about Dumpty that I didn't know already. Humpty Dumpty was a bad egg. I remembered him when he was new in town, a smart young animal trainer with a nice line in training mice to run up clocks. He went to bad pretty fast, though. Gambling and drink and women, it's the same story all over. A bright young kid thinks that the streets of Nurseryland are paved with gold, and by the time he finds out otherwise, it's much too late. Dumpty started off with extortions and robbery on a small scale. He trained up a team of spiders to scare little girls away from their curds and whey, which he'd pick up and sell on the black market. Then he moved on to blackmail, the nastiest game. We crossed paths once when I was hired by this young society kid, let's call him Georgie Porgy, to recover some compromising snaps of him kissing the girls and making them cry. I got the snaps, but I learned it wasn't healthy to mess with the fat man, and I don't make the same mistakes twice. Hell, in my line of work, I can't afford to make the same mistakes once. It's a tough world out there. I remember when Little Bo Peep first came to town, but you don't want to hear my troubles. If you're not dead yet, you've got troubles on your own. I checked out the newspaper files on Dumpty's death. One minute he was sitting on a wall. The next minute, he was in pieces at the bottom. All the king's horses and all the king's men were on the scenes in a minute, but he needed more than first aid. A medic named Foster was called, a friend of Dumpty's from his Gloucester days, although I don't know anything a doc can do when you're dead. Hang on a second, Dr. Foster. I got that old feeling you get in my line of work. Two little brain cells rub together the right way, and in seconds you've got a 24-karat cerebral fire on your hands. You remember that client who didn't show? The one I'd waited for all day on the street corner? An accidental death. I hadn't bothered to check it out. I can't afford to waste time on clients who aren't going to pay for it. 3 deaths, it seemed. Not one. I reached for the phone. I rang the police station. This is Horner, I told the desk. Let me speak to Sergeant O'Grady. There was a crackling, and he came on the line. O'Grady speaking. It's Horner. Hi, little Jack. That was just like O'Grady. He'd been kidding me about my size since we were kids together. You finally figured out that Dumpty's death was accidental? Nope. I'm now investigating 3 deaths. The fat man's, Bernie Robbins, and Dr. Foster's. Foster, the plastic surgeon? His death was an accident. Sure, and your mother was married to your father. There was a pause. Horner, if you phoned me up just to talk dirty, I'm not amused. Okay, wise guy. If Humpty Dumpty's death was an accident, and so was Dr. Foster's, tell me one thing. Who killed Cock Robin? I don't ever get accused of having too much imagination, but there was one thing I'd swear to. I could hear him grinning over the phone as he said, You did, Horner, and I'm staking my badge on it. The line went dead. My office was cold and lonely, so I wandered down to Joe's bar for some companionship and a drink or 3. 4 and 20 Blackbirds. A dead doctor, the fat man, Cock Robin. Heck, this case had more holes in it than a Swiss cheese and more loose ends than a torn string vest. And where did the juicy Miss Dumpty come into all of it? Jack and Jill, we'd make a great team. When this was all over, perhaps we could go off together to Louie's little place on the hill, where no one's interested in whether you've got a marriage license or not. The Pail of Water, that was the name of the joint. I called over to the bartender. Hey, Joe. Yeah, Mr. Horner. He was polishing a glass with a rag that had seen better days as a shirt. Did you ever meet the fat man's sister? He scratched at his cheek. Can't say that I did. His sister, huh? Hey, the fat man didn't have a sister. You sure of that? Sure, I'm sure. It was the day my sister had her first kid. I told the fat man I was an uncle. He gave me this look and says, no way I'll ever be an Uncle Joe. Got no sisters or brothers, nor no other kinfolk neither. If the mysterious Miss Dumpty wasn't his sister, who was she? Tell me, Joe, did you ever see him in here with a dame, about so high, shaped like this? My hands described a couple of parabolas. Looks like a blonde love goddess. He shook his head. Never saw him with any dames. Recently he was hanging around with some medical guy, but the only thing he ever cared about was those crazy birds and his animals of his. I took a swig of my drink. I nearly took the roof of my mouth off. Animals? I thought he'd given all that up. Nah, a couple weeks back he was in here with a whole bunch of blackbirds. He was training to sing. Wasn't that a dainty dish to set before? Yeah, I got no idea who. I put my drink down. A little bit of it spilt on the counter and I watched it strip the paint. Thanks, Joe. You've been a big help. I handed him a $10 bill. For information received, I said, adding, don't spend it all at once. My profession, it's making little jokes like that keep you sane. I had one contact left, Ma Hubbard. I found a payphone and called her number. Old Mother Hubbard's cupboard, cake shop and licensed soup kitchen. It's Horner, Ma. Jack, it ain't safe for me to talk to you. For old time's sake, sweetheart, you owe me a favor. Some two big crooks had once knocked off the cupboard, leaving it bare. I'd tacked them down and returned the cakes and soup. Okay, but I don't like it. You know everything that goes around here on the food front, Ma. What's the significance of a pie with 4 and 20 trained blackbirds in it? She whistled long and low. You really don't know? I wouldn't be asking you if I did. You should read the court pages of the paper next time, sugar. Jeez, you are out of your depth. Come on, Ma, spill it. It so happens there was a particular dish that was set before the king a few weeks back. Jack, are you still there? I'm still here, ma'am, I said quietly. All of a sudden, a lot of things are starting to make sense. I put down the phone. It was beginning to look like little Jack Horner had pulled a plum from this pie. It was raining, steady and cold, and I phoned a cab. Quarter of an hour later, one lurched out of the darkness. You're late, so complain to the tourist board. I climbed back, wound down the window, and lit a cigarette. And I went to see the Queen. The door to the private part of the palace was locked. It's the part the public don't get to see, but I've never been public, and the little lock hardly slowed me up. The door to the private apartments with a big red heart on it was unlocked, so I knocked and walked straight in. The Queen of Hearts was alone, standing in front of the mirror, holding a plate of jam tarts with one hand, powdering her nose with the other. She turned, saw me, and gasped, dropping the tarts. Hey, Queenie, I said, or would you feel more comfortable if I called you Jill? She was still a good-looking slice of dame, even without the blonde wig. Get out of here, she hissed. I don't think so, Toots. I sat down on the bed. Let me spell a few things out for you. Go ahead. She reached behind her for a concealed alarm button. I let her press it. I'd cut the wires on my way in. In my profession, there's no such thing as being too careful. Let me spell a few things out for you. You just said that. I'll tell this my way, lady. I lit a cigarette, and a thin plume of blue smoke drifted heavenwards, which was where I was going if my hunch was wrong. Still, I've learned to trust hunches. Try this on for size, Dumpty. The fat man wasn't your brother. He wasn't even your friend. In fact, he was blackmailing you. He knew all about your nose. She turned whiter than the number of corpses I've met in my business. Her hand reached up and cradled her freshly powdered nose. You see, I've known the fat man for many years, and many years ago he had a lucrative concern in trading animals and birds to do certain unsavory things. And that got me to thinking. I had a client recently who didn't show due to him having been stiffed first. Dr. Foster of Gloucester, the plastic surgeon. The official version of his death was that he just sat too close to a fire and melted. But just suppose that he was killed to stop him from telling something that he knew. I put 2 and 2 together and hit the jackpot. Let me reconstruct a scene for you. You were out in the garden, probably hanging out some clothes, when along came one of Dumpty's trained pie blackbirds and pecked off your nose. So there you were, standing in the garden, your hand in front of your face, when along comes the fat man with an offer you can't refuse. He could introduce you to a plastic surgeon who could fix you up with a nose as good as new for a price, and no one would ever need to know. Am I right? She nodded dumbly, then finding her voice muttered, "Pretty much, but I ran back into the parlor after the attack to eat some bread and honey. That was where he found me." Fair enough. The color was starting to come back into her cheeks now. So you had the operation from Foster, and no one was going to be any wiser until Dumpty told you that he had photos of the op. You had to get rid of him. A couple days later, you were walking in the palace grounds. There was Humpty sitting on a wall, his back to you, gazing out into the distance. In a fit of madness, you pushed, and Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. But now, you knew you were in big trouble. No one suspected you of his murder. But where were the photographs? Foster didn't have them, although he smelled the rat and had to be disposed of before he could see me. But you didn't know how much he'd told me, and you still didn't have the snapshots, so you took me on to find out. And that was your mistake, sister. Her lower lip trembled, and my heart quivered. You won't turn me in, will you? Sister, you tried to frame me this afternoon. I don't take kindly to that. I shook my head. Sorry, Your Majesty. Oh, sorry. With a shaking hand, she tried to unbutton her blouse. Perhaps we could come to some kind of arrangement? I shook my head. Sorry, Your Majesty. Mrs. Horner's little boy Jack was always taught to keep his hands off of royalty. It's a pity, but that's how it is. To be on the safe side, I looked away, which was a mistake. A cute little lady's pistol was in her hands and pointing at me before he could sing a song of sixpence. This shooter may have been small, but I knew it packed enough of a wallop to take me out of the game permanently. This dame was lethal. Put that gun down, Your Majesty. Sergeant O'Grady strolled through the bedroom door, his police special clutched in his ham-like fist. I'm sorry, I suspected you, Horner, he said dryly. You're lucky I did, though. Sure, and begorra. Sorry. I had you trailed here, and I overheard the entire thing. Hi, Sarge. Thanks for stopping by, but I haven't finished my explanation. If you'll take a seat, I'll wrap it up. He nodded brusquely and sat down near the door. His gun hardly moved. I got up from the bed and walked over to the Queen. You see, Toots, what I didn't tell you was who did have the snaps of your nose job. Humpty did when you killed him. A charming frown frinkled her perfect brow. I don't understand. I had the body searched. Sure, afterwards. But the first people to get the fat man were the king's men, the cops. And one of them pocketed the envelope. When any fuss had died down, the blackmail would have started again. Only this time you wouldn't have known who to kill, and I owe you an apology. I bent down to tie my shoelaces. Why? I accused you of trying to frame me this afternoon. You didn't. That arrow was the property of a boy who was the best archer in my school, and I should have recognized that distinctive fletching anywhere. Isn't that right? I said, turning back to the door. Sparrow O'Grady. Under the guise of tying up my shoelaces, I had already palmed a couple of the Queen's jam tarts, and flinging one of them upwards, I neatly smashed the room's only light bulb. It only delayed the shooting a few seconds, but a few seconds was all I needed, and the Queen of Hearts and Sergeant Sparrow O'Grady cheerfully shot each other to bits. I split. In my business, you have to look after number one. Munching on a jam tart, I walked out of the palace grounds and into the street. I paused by a trash can. to burn the manila envelope of photographs I had pulled from O'Grady's pocket as I walked past him, but it was raining so hard that I wouldn't catch. When I got back to my office, I phoned the tourist board to complain. They said the rain was good for the farmers, and I told them what they could do with it. They said that things are tough all over, and I said, yeah. So that was another Neil Gaiman short story. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Saturday Night Stories. It's starting to rain, kind of loudly, so I think I'll cut it here. Thanks for watching, and if you have any requests for future editions or recommendations or recommendations on beverages or food that I can eat or drink during these sessions, go ahead and sound off in the comments. I'm happy to read them. Thanks.